Alrighty, so we're gonna get started. I'm Mary Beth Gassman. It's really lovely to be here with all of you. I'm a professor at Rutgers University, and I also am very honored to be the executive director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. And we are sponsoring this book talk today. It's part of our annual book series. We are really, really excited to be sponsoring it. The title of today's event is Anthony Benezet, and it is a Quaker abolitionist and anti-racist. And I'm excited to have the author with us of this great book, David Chanoff, who is a visiting research scholar at Brandeis University. I was talking with David, who I've known for a long, long time, and we've collaborated a little in the past. And I was talking to him right before we got on with all of you, and he thinks it's his 26th book, my 25th or 26th book. He's just a prolific author, an amazing historian, and he also has a new book coming out in the fall, which is about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, and it's called They Fought Back with University of Toronto Press. So keep that on your radar. I did want to tell you before we get started that we have a discount code for his current book. And it is for 30% off from University of Georgia Press. So Giselle on our team is going to put that in the chat so that you have that. And again, welcome everyone. We're really, really glad you're here. The way we're going to do this is a Q&A with David. I'm going to ask him a lot of questions about his latest work, and we are going to have some time for questions from all of you. So if you have questions, we will get to them, and please put them in the Q&A, and we'd love to engage David with some of your questions. So David, first of all, welcome. So lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Mary Beth. It's a real pleasure. And it's a pleasure to see you again after a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, you've got this new book. I've read a lot of your work, and you're just a very, very comprehensive historian. You really, really go deep when you write things, and I'm very excited to learn more. I guess my first question for you is, Benezet's name is more or less unknown to most people, except for some scholars of the period. And so, how did you decide to write about him? How did this happen? How do you end up writing a book about him?
Well, you're right. Benezet is a figure of really not just national, but international importance. And yet he has completely slipped out of the national memory. So it's very unlikely that people know his name. The circle of scholars that deal with him is very, very small, although it's beginning to enlarge now. And I had never heard of him up until about 10 years ago. And I was researching a book on the impact of American revolutionary and democratic ideals in other countries. And I started coming across Benezet's name in regard to British abolitionism. And it turned out this was an individual who was a key element in the development of abolitionism and anti-slavery in England. And I thought, well, this is very strange. This is an American who has had that effect. And so I began looking into it further and found out that, well, it wasn't just England. He was a key figure in American abolitionism, and also he was absolutely central to stopping the transatlantic slave trade, which we all know about and have read about and have been exposed to quite substantially. So that was so. Then I started looking into it more deeply, and found that there wasn't very much written about him. That other than a few scholars, over 250 years, there was a biography early on. There was another biography in the 1930s. And then the University of Pennsylvania published one in 2009. So there were a number of people who were focused, but not many, and not that much information out there. So it certainly piqued my curiosity, and not just my curiosity, but uh, my attention to the whole idea of equality, of anti-slavery, of racism, and so on. And I thought that this would be a very, very interesting project. So,
Absolutely. And one thing that, thank you for that. And I have so many questions. One thing I was going to tell everyone is that I live in Philadelphia, and this past weekend on Sunday, I was walking down the street, and I looked up, and there was a historical marker for Benezet right in front of me, one that I've walked by at least 1,000 times. And I typically look at these, but I didn't make the connection that we were sponsoring this book talk and that it was the same person and that he had been walking all over the streets of Philadelphia, right in the neighborhood where I live, by the way. And so I shared that with David, who you said that you had seen this and that you had actually gone and walked where he walked so you could get a sense of like where he was in Philly, right?
yeah, that plaque, that historical marker, went up, I think, in 2016. So this is an individual who was flourishing in the 18th century,
Yeah,
and it took until 2016 to put up a marker. His house is long gone, but you can see, but it's in the old section of
it
Philadelphia.
is. Yeah.
So you can trace where he walked, where he talked to people. Uh, he uh, he walked almost every day on Front Street, which fronts the Delaware River, and that was where Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And Paine would have seen him looking out the front windows of his apartment. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's an interesting area.
Yeah, and I love that, I walked by it literally thousands of times and just happened to see it. So here's something I'm curious about. I've written biographies of people, and I'm a historian, and I know that, it can be really difficult to find sources, and Benezet did not keep a diary or journal. So his correspondence was almost all strategic, containing like very little personal information. So I'm curious, how were you able to write a biography given such a lack of the usual kinds of biographical material, especially for that time, right? How were you
Yeah,
able to do that?
yeah, that's really a great question because I'm not the only biographer who's faced this kind of situation. And we know about Benezet's accomplishments. We know about his writing. We know about his influence. But how do you write any kind of intimate biography if you don't have this personal kind of information that you mentioned? There's no diary, there's no journal. The references in his correspondence is voluminous, but it's almost all strategic. We have this problem, here's what we want to do. Here's this other problem, let's take this approach. There's very little personal information there. When I started this, I thought that I would be writing the kind of book that the biographer who did the biography of Benezet in 2009, which was very well researched. I thought I could probably uh, do a kind of enhanced job of that. But my editor said, no, you have to do something completely different. So that was quite a challenge. So the answer, or my answer to it, was that you look at Benezet's writing, and there were 4 or 5 major tracts and books and booklets, and you can see the through the progression of this writing, you can trace the evolution of his intellect, of his emotions, of his ideals, and of his objectives. So that gives you the ability to actually write a full-scale biography, an intimate biography, one that engages his personal life in I think in a very uh, acute way. So that was how this book evolved, and I was very pleased with that approach, and I really owe it to my editor who told me, no, you can't do the same things other people did. It's not going to work. So I
Yeah.
was very fortunate.
Editors can be pretty amazing like that, you know? You can end up writing such a better book because of advice that an editor gives you. So I'm glad you got that advice. It's good. It also leads to another question that I have is, how was Benezet's campaign against slavery different from that of other abolitionists? I mean, this is something that you're able to uncover through all of these sources, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Uh, that's an essential question. Benezet, of course, was an abolitionist, and he talked a great deal about the slave trade and the horrors of the slave trade. There were about 12.5 million Africans who were trafficked across the Atlantic, and the attrition rate was anywhere around 15% to 17%. It was probably more than that because that didn't account for the deaths that took place within Africa, the trafficking in Africa. So he did talk at length about that, and he talked at length about the treatment of slaves in the Americas and in the colonies. And other abolitionists, of course, talked about that too, and they talked about it uh, with a sense of outrage and fury at at these atrocities and murders that were perpetrated against this African enslaved population. And Benezet did that too. But what really sets him apart is that he didn't just write about the horrors of slavery and the need for fairness and justice and humanity. He he concentrated on the idea of equality. When you look at his works and you look at the progression of his work, what you see is this intense focus on the humanity of Black people and of the similarity and essential sameness of Black humanity and white humanity. So that business of equality is something that set Benezet apart from almost all the other abolitionists. There was so much material there, and the horrors were so extensive that it was easy to concentrate on that. And those were the things that infuriated people who were abolitionists anyway. Uh, but but Benezet was I think the only one who really focused on this idea of Black humanity and tried to create a definition for that, and that definition was the same definition that applied to white people.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. So he was a Quaker, right? Why were Quakers the first abolitionists?
Well, it really goes back to the founder of Quakerism, George Fox, in the 17th, mid-17th century. And Fox's story is worth knowing. Fox, as a young man, left home in a state of spiritual devastation, aridness. He felt devastated because he was unable to make any kind of spiritual connection. And he spent a couple of years wandering and talking to people, talking to priests and clerics and so on, and getting nowhere. And just at the point where he was at the end of his rope in despair, he said he didn't know what to do. He had a sudden revelation, a sudden inspiration that, in fact, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus, was inside of him. So that's not unique. It's not unique for people who are seeking for spiritual comfort. But what was genius about him is that he realized this about himself, and he also at the same time understood that what was true for him was true for everybody else. Not just some people, not people who were chosen, not people who were predestined, not people who followed religious customs and so on, but everybody had this sense of God within them. And that's a basic tenet of Quakerism. And it was initiated by Fox at the very beginning. And so there was this idea of the equality, the spiritual equality of all people. And that meant black people, white people, Indians, women, as well as men. Uh, it was universal. The Holy Spirit didn't differentiate, didn't discriminate. So here, Quakers had this central tenet of their faith was equality, at least equality in a spiritual way. Now that didn't mean equality in the other aspects of human life, but spiritually. So there was that basis. There was that basis that allowed them to look at people in terms of some kind of equal orientation. And that really, I think, was the basis for the development of Quaker abolitionism.
Thank you. Thank you. I learned a lot right there. So I really appreciate that. I've often wondered, just because of my own work related to historically Black colleges, a lot of the early ones like were there were Quakers involved in starting them. And so it's interesting to have that perspective that you just offered there as well. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is Benezet's first anti-slavery tract was published in 1754 when he was 41 years old. Why did he publish it then?
Um, Benezet arrived in Philadelphia with his family from England. They were originally French. They were French Huguenots, French Protestants who fled the suppression of Protestantism in France. They went first to England, and then they came to America, and they settled in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. So he came when he was 18 years old, and he was what we would call a late bloomer. Uh, he couldn't find exactly how to make a living for himself. He wasn't attracted to anything. We think no doubt he was against slavery, but he never really talked about that. And he finally got a job as a school teacher, and and eventually, in 1750, he started a school for black children. There was no education at all for so-called African children in any of the colonies. They were simply uh, left ignorant. They were illiterate. They couldn't count. They didn't know arithmetic. Um, they were really abject in terms of education. And Benezet saw that. And you talk about walking around Philadelphia, and Benezet spent time talking with Black people, understanding them, becoming friends with them, and many of them worked down near the waterfront because Philadelphia was on the Delaware River. It was the major port of the colonies. And he saw Black children running around. Some of them were apprenticed, some of them were with their parents. Many of them were just running free through the cities, and they were completely uneducated. And that did something to him. And in 1750, he opened a school in his own house, a night school for Blacks and, as they put it then, mulattoes. So he did that, and he was, by that time he was a veteran teacher, and what he saw, and this is absolutely essential to him. Um, what he saw was, so he was teaching white kids during the day, and he was teaching Black kids at night, and he was teaching them the same curriculum. So he was really the only person in all of the colonies that was able to make a comparison, an assessment of Blacks along with whites. And what he said about it was very, not just interesting, but key to his own development. And I'm just going to read his statement about that. He says, I can with truth and sincerity declare that I have found amongst the Negroes as great variety of talents as among the like number of whites, and I'm bold to assert that the notion entertained by some that Blacks are inferior in their capacities is a vulgar prejudice founded on the pride or ignorance of their lordly masters, who have kept them their slaves at such a distance as to be unable to form a judgment of them. So he found early on in this process, in 1750, he found that there was this equivalent in terms of intelligence, in terms of talent, in terms of discipline, in terms of engagement, that there was an equivalence between whites and Blacks. And at that point, he began talking about slavery, and he began talking about it in a very public way that was very different from his previous uh, uh, from the times previous to that. And it took him some time to get his thoughts together. But in 1754, which was several years later, he wrote his first tract against slavery.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining all that. It's interesting too because I had written read about, early schools, and I think most of the other really early schools for Black children were in about the 1770s. So this one would have been a little bit earlier here in Philadelphia. And you really talk about it as being kind of revolutionary, right? And leading to his like a big pivot in his anti-slavery life. And you just mentioned a minute ago about how he started speaking out publicly. Were there other things that he started doing as a result of what he was learning through teaching these children?
Other things that he was doing. Well, he was very reform-minded, so he did write about the evils of alcohol, about the evils of tobacco. But these were kind of minor sidelights for him. Uh, his primary attention was on slavery. Uh, so yeah, this was a pivotal moment for him, and You said there were other schools that did start in the 1770s, which is absolutely correct. But we're talking about 20 years before that. Benezet, by the way, uh, initiated the first day school for girls in the country because it wasn't the country, of course, it was the colonies. Because up until that time, girls' education was considered frivolous, secondary. It didn't have any kind of seriousness to it as education for boys and men. So Benezet persuaded the Quakers. The Quakers had the school system in Philadelphia was a kind of semi-public Quaker school system, and he persuaded the Quakers to start a school for girls. They did that. He persuaded the Quakers also in 1770 to start a school for blacks. It was called the African School. Uh, but he himself was teaching at home. So yeah, that was absolutely revolutionary, and I don't think people, I mean, people understand that, and it's been noted by his biographers and so on. But the kind of creativity that he brought to the educational culture of the country was quite vast.
Thank you. So one thing I'm curious about is you talked a little bit about his relationship with Black people in Philadelphia. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And also, did he influence Black abolitionists at all?
Yeah. Uh, well, Benezet was really a unique individual. And there was something about his personality. First of all, we talked about his lack of ego. Uh, he didn't write a journal. He didn't keep a diary. These things were distractions for him. I don't think he ever even thought about it. And he, uh, so he did that. And I'm sorry, Mary Beth, could you ask that question again?
Sure, I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about his
Oh
relationship
yeah,
with
yeah, of
Black
course,
people and influence,
of
maybe did
course.
he influence Black abolitionists?
Yeah, of course. So he spent a great deal of time befriending and talking to Black people down where they were working. He had personal friends who were Black. When I came across that, I asked some of my colleagues who were specialists in that area whether there were other abolitionists who had social friendships with Black people. And it's a question that they weren't able to answer because it was just so unusual. And yet he did. And so that's one of the kind of unique dimensions of his personality. Uh, and did he influence Black people? There were, first of all, there were Black abolitionists, leading Black abolitionists who attended his school. So it wasn't just, I think, that they learned arithmetic, they learned reading, they learned writing, and so on, the usual curriculum. It was that they were in an environment, in a school environment that incorporated the sense of their humanity and potential. And when you're in that kind of environment, that stimulates people in a way that they're not going to be stimulated otherwise. So yes, he was quite influential among leading American Black abolitionists like James Forten, Absalom Jones, and and also the major British Black abolitionists, Kwabena, Kwagano, and Equiano, who wrote very influential books, anti-slavery books, quoting him. referencing him and acknowledging his importance for them. So yes, he had a great deal of impact among Black abolitionists.
Thank you. So that actually leads me to another question I had, which was you mentioned Britain, right? And how did Benezet's work help trigger British abolitionism? How did that? You talked about a little bit about the influence on British Black abolitionists, but I'm curious, like just the larger sense of that. How did that work?
That's a story that's worth a book all by itself. Uh, uh, British abolitionism really began a good deal later than American abolitionism. First of all, there were relatively few slaves in England. There might have been 15,000 or so, and they were household slaves and so on. Of course, Great Britain owned colonies in the Indies, in the West Indies, that enslaved hundreds of thousands of people over the years. But within England itself, there were relatively few black people. So abolitionism didn't become a subject there until at one point there was a black slave whose master was quite vicious and used to beat him, and at one point beat him so badly that it looked like he was dying. His name was Jonathan Strong. That is the enslaved person. And his master threw him out on the street as worthless goods, a person who was going to die. But Strong managed not to die and to get up and to make his way to the house of a surgeon who provided services for indigent people. And there he met uh, the surgeon's brother, whose name was Granville Sharp. And Granville Sharp took him to his brother. They they took him to the hospital, but 2 years later, and they got him a job when he eventually got out of the hospital. 2 years later, his old master saw him on the street and saw what he felt was still his property and now his healthy property. And so he claimed him. But Strong opposed that. And the case went to the Lord Mayor. And Strong, as the case was developing, found one of Benezet's books. And that gave him all the information that he needed in order to pursue that case. And Strong was freed by the Lord Mayor. And this was kind of unbelievable. Here's a black person owned by a white person, and the Lord Mayor freed him. Uh, Sharp, Granville Sharp, who was the hero of this story, um, became the leading voice in British abolitionism. And 7 years later, there was another case that had much greater consequences that he pursued, and that was decided by the chief magistrate. And again, he found Benezet's latest book, and that provided the information for his barristers, his lawyers, to pursue this, and they won that case as well. So that was really the origin of British abolitionism. That's number one. Number two is that Benezet had, over a period of time, his correspondence was really voluminous, and he brought people into his circle, and one of them was Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And Wesley had always been against slavery, but he had never really talked about it much. But he also found one of Benezet's books, and the same book actually that impacted Granville Sharp. And he read that book And he said that there has never been anything like this before. And from that point on, he he spotlighted slavery and abolitionism and wrote his own book that was widely popular. And in his book, he lifted whole sections of Benezet's book. There were no plagiarism laws, and Benezet was very happy about it when he found out. But part of Wesley's book was actually Benezet's book. And Wesley, of course, Wesley had created a movement that was so significant, a religious movement that so significant that's still significant today. And he was a preacher, primarily a preacher, really. He probably gave 5,000, 6,000 sermons over the course of his life. He'd give two or three or even four sermons a day. He said that he never encountered a congregation that he couldn't move with his preaching. Some of these congregations were so large he had to speak to them outdoors because there was no space indoors. And he was such a powerhouse preacher. I'm going to read just a little bit from his book, if you don't mind, very slightly. So Wesley, addressing the slavers, says, "Do you never feel another's pain? Have you no sympathy, no sense of human woe, no pity for the miserable? When you saw the flowing eyes, the heaving breasts, where the bleeding sides and tortured limbs of your fellow creatures, was you a stone or a brute? Did you look on them with the eyes of a tiger?" He was an extraordinary writer, extraordinary speaker, and he became a very close ally of Benezet and used Benezet's work. So that's only part of the story. Do we have time for me to tell the last
Yes,
part of the
yes,
story?
yes, yes.
So the last and even more consequential part of the story has to do with uh, Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was a student at Cambridge University. He was studying to become uh, a cleric, and so he was engaged in divinity studies. And when he was a junior there, he uh, competed for the Latin Essay Prize, the Junior Latin Essay Prize, which he won. And so when he was a senior, he competed for the Senior Latin Essay Prize. And the question for the prize was, is it legal to enslave people against their will? And he didn't know what to write because he had never been involved with slavery, anti-slavery, abolitionism. He knew nothing about it. But he found one of Benezet's books as well. And it gave him all the information he needed. He won the Senior Latin Essay Prize at Cambridge University, which really catapulted him into the firmament of English, the English intellectual world anyway. Um, and he was so taken by what he had read there that he couldn't sleep. He said he writes about it. He says on his way back from Cambridge, giving a reading in Cambridge to his home in London, he had to get off his horse and walk and then sit down and to think that if these things were true about the slave trade, somebody had to put an end to these calamities. And that was Clarkson. And Thomas Clarkson decided that that was going to be his life mission. And he hooked up with the Quakers. And the Quakers were the only group in England at that time that was actually involved with abolitionism and was agitating about it. And a committee was formed. He became the kind of central figure in that committee, anti-slavery committee, and he brought in William Wilberforce, who was the great reform leader in the British Parliament. And Wilberforce was the one who initiated the campaign against the slave trade. And his first speech was Benezet, by the way, had died, was dead at this point, but it was as if his spirit had spoken directly to Clarkson. And so the campaign against slavery in Parliament, which of course generated tremendous conflict with the sugar industry, with the shipping industry. It took from 1807, from excuse me, 1788 to 1807, before the Brits outlawed the slave trade. And Great Britain dominated the slave trade. So when they outlawed it, that really brought things to an end. And Wilberforce, in his speeches in Parliament, used Benezet's language. He used Benezet's strategies and so on. And so you see this really, really pervasive influence that Benezet uh, uh, Benezet impacted the British abolitionist movement with.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm learning an incredible amount and I'm really appreciative of it. I also really enjoy the way you um uh tell the stories of what happened in Benezet. So I have one last question from me and then we're going to open it up because we've got a bunch of questions from the audience. But my last question is as I'm looking at your work, I noticed that French revolutionary Jacques-Pierre Bissot wrote, who was equal to Benezet? Who was more useful to society, to mankind? And I guess I'm curious about that quote, and also what was Benezet's greatest contribution to the world's humanitarian progress from your research?
Uh, well, that puts a, light on the question of why he isn't known. So Brissot, the French revolutionary, said, who was more virtuous, who was more significant than Benezet? Gary Wills, the cultural historian, said that Benezet uh, was the one authentic American saint. Uh, so here's this individual who had this huge impact on people that's recognized. When you look, even back then, if you look at his funeral, it was the biggest funeral in Philadelphia history. There were hundreds and hundreds of people who followed the cortege, black people, white people. It went to the Arch Street burial ground. He was lowered into an unmarked grave. Uh, he wanted no monuments. He wanted no speeches. Uh, he wanted no. He didn't allow any portrait of himself. He said, my ugly visage isn't going to go down into posterity." And one Revolutionary War veteran who was at that burial, at that funeral, said, "I would rather be Benezet in his grave than George Washington with all his fame." So this is the individual that we've been dealing with here, and it's it's an extraordinary case that he isn't known, that he isn't a central part of our sense of the development of justice, the development of equality, that he simply is not known. Uh, but he needs to be known. And that was one of my objectives in writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. Now I've got some from our audience. Are you ready for them?
I'll try.
Okay. So the first one is, You talked a little bit about this, but the person may have joined a little bit late, so I just want if you can elaborate. It was just mentioned that Benezet was let's see, a, a prolific writer. So, what was the source for this research? So, was that the source for this research? They're asking about where are the letters located and who are they to? So you did mention letters. So can you talk a little bit about where these letters are, who they're to, the correspondence, and also a little bit more about like all the different kind of writing that you took a look at?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of his writing, so there are maybe four major tracts and a couple of less important ones, though also significant. And the first one, it's so interesting that the first one was a kind of remonstrance against the slave trade, against the horrors of it, a plea to his Quaker community uh, to uh, to release people from bondage, uh, to engage with their sense of fairness, with their sense of humanity, and so on. And it had almost no effect. Quakers had slaves, the same as other people, and there were some Quakers who even dealt in the slavery business. So at that point, Benezet realized that he needed to take another direction. And the direction he took, he felt, I don't know to what extent he was really cognizant of this, uh, but the direction he took was to look at Black people who were considered uneducable, uh, slothful, dull, and to look at them and try to define them as human in the same way that whites were defined as human. And that was the pivot that he made when he found, when he was teaching Black kids, that they were equally talented, equally intelligent. And from there, you can look at his works as, first of all, expanding that idea of Black humanity, uh, so that Blacks, he showed, were moral in the same sense that whites were. And then he realized that he had to try to give a picture of Black people and Black community under normal circumstances. What were they like? And it was impossible to do that uh, for American Blacks because slavery had exerted such a dehumanizing influence and impact on people. So most American Blacks were enslaved, and even those who weren't, who were free, were subject to terrible restrictions in their lives. And so you were looking at a population that was ignorant, that had all of these negative developments that slavery brought with it. So you couldn't find a normal Black community in America to look at. And so what Benezet did was to look at Africa because there were all sorts of writings by this time of people who had lived in Africa and had lived with, of Europeans who had lived there for many years, who knew the African communities. And what they were saying was that when you see Africans in their native circumstances, living under normal conditions, that they were generous, they were affable, they were rational, they were community oriented. They had all of these attributes, the same as decent white people had. And so you see Benezet expanding that sense of Black humanity. And that's what you see in his writing. And in he wrote letters to everybody he possibly could, everybody that came on his radar screen, including the major names in American Revolutionary history. And sometimes he was successful in changing their minds, and sometimes he wasn't. But you see, and the letters are collected, the writings are collected in a critical edition, so they're available. When I started writing this book, you had to look at facsimiles of 18th century material, but now there's a critical edition, and letters and writings are all available.
So, one another question is, why is Benezet? I mean, you talked a little bit about this, but I'd love for you to just like, I guess, help us think through this. Like, why is he largely absent from America's historical memory? Like, why? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Folks are interested.
Yeah, I'm interested in it too, and I don't have any definitive answer except that he was there at the beginning. He was involved in the mid 18th century. So abolitionism had begun actually among Quakers outside of Philadelphia in the late 17th century, but but it was uh, but but it was only these gadflies here and there that took up the cause. And Benezet was really involved at the very beginning, and this is pre-Revolutionary War. So first of all, I think that the fact that the war came, which was such a huge event, a globally important event, I think that overshadowed him and the other very early people. Uh, but but he did have an impact that lasted, of course, not just in England, but in America, even after his death. So his books were the main source for the first Encyclopedia Britannica articles about Africa. But then other abolitionists and the ones that are much better known, came to the fore, like William Lloyd Garrison, for example, and but many others, and and the origins of it, and he was there at the origin of it, that faded into the background. That was number one. Number two, I think, and I'm just speculating here really, but I think that his emphasis on the equality of blacks and whites became something that was, uh, you know, that that was a real uh, fundamental disturbance in American life. And so that subject, and it's still with us today. I mean, you can't have a discussion without a lingering ambiance of the idea that black people aren't quite up to the level of white people. It's there. It's like it's like a miasma in the background, and so all of these things together sort of put him into the past, and it hasn't been he hasn't been revived. But when you look at his career and his impact, there's no question that he was one of the most important activists in American history. Quite on the level, by the way, in my opinion, of Martin Luther King. And I think that he will be recognized eventually.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I have one last question for you. This is from Jennifer, and she said, I taught for 3 decades in a department that educated future educators in California, and I made sure to read that wonderful quote from Benezet about the equality of his black and white students every semester. My own research is based in the 1830s, and there you see it is the black abolitionist and the white women anti-racist abolitionists who extol Benezet. Do you get into that history at all in your book?
No, I didn't take it up through there. Benezet himself died in 1784, and which was right after the end of the Revolutionary War. And his impact in England was vast after his death, also in the United States. So I think that that questioner is quite right. He was very important for those early abolitionists in the 19th century. And you find, for example, uh, uh, James Forten, a black abolitionist who was also one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia at the time, was a major supporter of William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator. And Forten had gone to Benezet School.
Mm.
Uh, and Fortin's aunt was actually a good friend of Benezet's. So yeah, he did have that influence. He had a very strong influence, but it got diffused, it got dissipated, and then it slowly disappeared into the background.
Well, David, I just want to say thank you so much for this great conversation. I personally learned so much. I'm hoping that our audience also learned a lot, hoping that they'll pick up your book and look for future books. Thank you. I'm always blown away when people can have such a riveting conversation just off the top of their head. So, so it's really, really great. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you. And for those in the audience, we have more books in our Proctor book series, and we are already scheduling a lot more books for next year. So please join us. And for those of you asking, yes, you will get a recording of this discussion, and hopefully you can use it in classes or in the best ways possible. Again, thank you so much, David.